All right, our viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good day to all our viewers all over the world, and welcome to this week's special episode of Global Arena, recorded on Friday, the 3rd of February, 2023. And the show is coming to you from Global Arena TV. My name is Umar Isa Dandago. Well, this is a show that tries to get different people from different corners of the world to tell us their stories and also analyze their own issues by themselves so as to get the bigger picture. And we do that for the consumption of our local audiences who are very much keenly interested in what's going on in other countries. Today, we are taking a microscopic look at the media of a country that calls itself proudly the world's largest democracy, in quote. What does that mean? And is it in terms of free and fair elections or allowing the minorities to practice their religions freely? Well, we will get to know that in the course of the program. India, which is said to be the second most populous nation on earth, is always an interesting country to look at from any angles. You've got the Bollywood giving us a great deal of entertainment, even though there are lots of elements of Hindu nationalism echoed in some of its films. And it's, of course, the norm to portray the Muslims, especially the Pakistanis, as quote unquote terrorists in many of those movies. Our main focus today is on the Indian media industry, which is said to be quote unquote toxic and one-sided. Well, India is a home to many media organizations, according to Statista.com. As of June 2022, 892 channels were available on satellite television across India. And according to Wikipedia, there are 70,000 newspapers, which makes India the biggest newspaper market in the world, and with over 100 million copies sold each day. This is really massive. And maybe this is due to the population of the country with about 1.3 or approximately 1.4 billion people. Recently, the BBC World Service released a documentary on a massacre that took place in the state of Gujarat in 2002, in which more than 1,000 people were killed, many of whom Muslims. Something but what has angered the Indians is how that massacre has been linked to the then Chief Minister Narendra Modi, who is currently the Indian Prime Minister. This and many more complex issues will thoroughly be dissected and discussed and analyzed on this show. And to do that, I'm joined from Bangalore by Dr. Ram Bhat. He is a co-founder of Mara, a media and arts collective in Bangalore, India. He is also a fellow at the Media and Communications Department of London School of Economics, rather. His research interests include subjects such as community media, communication infrastructure, disinformation, and violence from a global South perspective. Well, a lot of things will thoroughly be discussed here, like I said. And to do that, I'm joined by Dr. Ram Bhat from Bangalore. Thank you very much indeed, Doctor, for being on the show.
Thank you. Thanks, Umar, for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be able to talk to your audience and to you. And it's an honor to be here.
Well, the honor is mine and the pleasure is also mine. I don't know, let me start with this funny question. I forgot to tell you that I'm an English teacher. There is this English academy here in Kano called Kamfa that I teach. Mostly we teach adults. And in the course of my teaching, I try, because of my friendship with some Indians and because of my love for Bollywood movies and music, I try, if I want to make my students laugh, to copy and mimic the Indian accent. How do you feel when somebody mimic your accents? Is that a mockery or a commendation or an appreciation or something like that?
I'm always very amused when I hear someone try to mimic the Indian accent. because to me and to many Indians, it just seems normal. But when you hear someone else speak with an Indian accent, it seems absurd, that it's a realization that do I actually sound like that? So I guess it's kind of entertaining to hear non-Indians trying to mimic the Indian accent. But
So, yeah,
generally, I think
yeah.
Indians are get easily offended. So it's a matter of personal taste. But I'm not offended. I'm quite amused.
Okay. So when generally, as you said, when the Indians hear me saying, "Hello, my name is Umar, and I'm very, very happy to be with you, Mr. Ram Bhat," so they feel offended, huh, and they feel like we're
Yeah,
trying to mock them.
yeah. Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, but I feel like it's out of passion and interest and sheer love that we have for you guys.
No, I hope Indians can learn to see it that way.
So is it true now that the Indians are aggressive in nature?
I don't know about Indians. As you said, we are a very large country. So in any large society, especially in the subcontinent, we have a lot of diversity.
Mm.
So I don't think there is a, standard Indian kind of profile. But certainly for various reasons, in the online world, Indians often come across as being quite aggressive, easily offended, very rude, you know. So the online Indian is probably has that image attached to them, and usually the male Indian. But
Okay.
if you really visit India and talk to different kinds of Indians, you will see a very different and a very diverse picture emerging.
But in most of the Indian movies that we watch, we see a lot of violence and we see how aggressive the men are, even towards the female counterparts and towards other men in India. Is it a perfect representation of how the Indians are in reality?
I don't think so, but no representation is without some correspondence to reality. So I think there is some truth to it, but also a lot of the Bollywood cinema or some of the larger than life cinema coming out of India definitely appeals to a masculinity or a notion of Indian masculinity, which I think Indian male viewers find it attractive. So the films are geared towards a particular audience, which invests in that kind of representation of Indian men.
Here in northern Nigeria, where we live, especially here in Kano, we have a film industry, which is the biggest in the north, not in the south. In the south, there is Nollywood. Probably it's more popular than the Kannywood that we have in the north here, which is opposite of what is obtainable in India. The northern Indian industry or the northern industry in India, it's Bollywood, right, which is the second largest in the world. And it's sort of like suppresses the others, the Hollywood, and so on and so forth. Even the other woods that could sound funny. Here in northern Nigeria, a lot of critics are saying that the film industry that claims to represent our culture, Hausa culture, and Muslims, is not doing enough to represent us. Does it happen in India that people are complaining what we see in the Bollywood films are not what the Indians are and is not the real culture of the Indians? I mean, what's the
Of
debate?
course, of course, there has been a very strong and a very long critique of Bollywood cinema that it is absolutely not representative of the diversity of this country. Just a simple example, most people who you see on the Bollywood screen are fair-skinned.
Yeah,
But
fair skinned.
actually, yeah, but actually, if you come to India, you will see
Mm,
that majority of the people are not fair-skinned.
yeah.
Or if you look at the names of the characters, you will find that they are mostly upper caste or so-called upper caste,
Mm.
dominant caste Hindus.
Mm.
but in reality, dominant caste Hindus are a small minority of the population. So,
Okay.
in reality, I think the country looks very different from what it looks in Bollywood. A small elite minority kind of has captured how Bollywood represents India.
Um, okay. Let's talk about your early career in journalism and media. You started telling me before we started recording that you worked as a radio presenter, as a radio journalist, and you up to now you're dealing with community radio stations. Talk us through your experiences with radio stations in India.
So I was not really a radio presenter. I was more kind of a local radio or a community radio researcher. I was doing research on community radio, and I was
Oh,
also doing some training programs for community radio stations, uh, kind of helping
correct.
local programming, with helping with editing, helping with using digital tools for archiving, that kind of thing, you know. So, and then over the years, I have also done some work on community radio policy, uh, working with various other colleagues and friends. So it's been a long journey. I've been working with community radio in India, in South Asia, and more broadly with radio broadcasters in Asia Pacific since more or less since 2004.
Wow, that's great.
And I feel that the number of radio stations have greatly increased, both in India and in the subcontinent. But there have been several troubling tendencies with community radio across the region. Um, Most of them have severe restrictions on what kind of content can be broadcast. Most of them are severely dependent on government resources in the form of sponsorship or dependent on a few donors who will sponsor some kind of programs. So many of the small radio stations are still struggling to be truly editorially and financially independent.
So you're telling me that the government of India acts more or less like a dictator to radio stations in India as to what to produce and how to produce.
Especially with radio, because radio is an analog medium. So when you broadcast on FM, there is no way the government in Delhi can broadcast what a local radio in some small town or village is broadcasting. There is no practical way to monitor a radio. So it prefers to issue a blanket censorship that says no news or current affairs can be broadcast on radio, whether it's entertainment commercial radio or whether it's community radio. Only government owned public radio can broadcast news and current affairs.
Only, what did you say? Only government-owned radio stations can broadcast
Yeah,
news?
yes.
Oh, okay, India prides itself of being secular country, secular nation, the largest democracy in the world, and so on and so forth. But it would be surprising, if not baffling, to hear that privately owned media organizations in India, okay, radio stations here, there in India, in this part, are not allowed to broadcast news of even local politics, let alone Indian, British political turmoil or Chinese, Indian political animosity, something like that. How come?
Yeah, because, in India, secular, lot of the people in government and people sympathetic to the current government are trying to remove the word secular from our constitution.
Okay.
They think India should be a Hindu country. So that is
Okay.
going on. And the way a vibrant democracy is interpreted is purely on the issue of holding regular elections which are reasonably fair. Now, there is a lot of doubt on whether the elections are reasonably fair. I don't want to get into that.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, the view of democracy is very narrow because it is interpreted in terms of procedure. A more substantive idea of democracy would include, um, you know, representation of minorities, economic equality, so that there is a some meaning to the freedom of speech. If people do not have the resources to speak, then freedom of speech is meaningless, right? So in those substantive terms, India would perform quite poorly on democracy.
So are you saying India is not a real democracy now?
I think there are some aspects of life in India which are quite democratic, and there are some aspects which are very, very undemocratic. So I think it would be a mistake to give a blanket approval to India as a vibrant democracy. I think most people would not agree. But there are some things which, like in any country, there is a lot of freedom, mostly because the state cannot monitor you yet on in these domains. Yeah.
So what's the problem when the Hindu nationalist government tries to make India Hindu-centric or an Indian country? What's the problem? Because not only you, but a lot of other people are concerned about this issue, this debate of removing the secular word from the constitution and making India a more Hindu country.
Because, like I was saying, the word Hindu is a recent kind of historical phenomenon, and it's actually hides the fact that there is a whole cluster of castes that are vertically and hierarchically arranged. So those who are at the bottom of this hierarchy have no interest in identifying themselves as Hindu because they have only faced disadvantages in this system of Hindu. Uh, and not to mention people who have officially converted to other religions. India has a very large number of minorities who have converted to Islam, who have converted to Christianity. So then they become second class citizens if India is seen as a religious state. So I think it would be quite a disaster if India
Yeah.
officially becomes a religious state.
For our viewers who may not have this information, India, the population of Muslims in India is over 200 million, which is very much higher than the entire population of Nigeria, my country. So it's an irony that some 200 million people are considered the minorities there. Yeah, oh, definitely, it's because of the Indian population of
And
1.3 or
also
4.
another interesting point, Umar, which I wanted to make, if you see official numbers, okay, last census was done in 2011. You will find that the Christian population is, let's say, 3 to 4%. Okay,
3 to
uh,
4%.
3 to 4%. So that also is a huge number. But actually, on the ground, you will find that a lot of people have converted to Christianity in practice, which means they go to church, they believe in the word of Jesus, and so on. But they have not officially converted their religion.
As in how?
Because,
The
let's
government
say,
doesn't
sorry,
the government doesn't recognize them as Christians?
No, no, they themselves don't want to officially be recognized as a Christian. They want to practice their Christianity in private, but they will not officially convert to another religion for various reasons.
Why?
There is strong reasons not to officially convert, but convert only in daily life. Because, for example, like in the US, there is affirmative action for African Americans. Similarly, in India, there is reservation for people who have belonged to the oppressed castes, the lower end of the hierarchy I was talking about.
Yeah,
Now,
of
if
course.
they convert to Christianity, then they lose those protections, they lose some welfare from the state, they lose the reservation of jobs, of seats in colleges, and so on and so forth, if you become a religious minority.
This is very serious, and this is what makes India a really complex country to study. Yeah, let's move on. Another complexity that we need to talk about is the Indian media. Of course, last night I was watching some clips of serious debates, which could be termed as a violent debate live on a live television show conducted by Arnab Goswami. He's a really funny presenter. I'm sure you know him, with his friend Waris Patan. Like there's a clip which has been watched, I think, over 1 million times on YouTube. It has got more than 1 million viewers on YouTube for the past 5 years. And can you imagine, for the space of 2 minutes and a few seconds, none of them was hearing each other. Like they were having this, what could an American person or even a Nigerian person could describe as a silly debate about national anthem. Nobody was listening to one another at that time. And this is not only the problem of Arnab Goswami, who is said to be very aggressive, very harsh on Muslims and other people. And a lot of people are criticizing him for being too pro Modi and pro BJP and so on and so forth. There are other media channels, especially TV ones, that are also echoing the Hindu nationalistic ideologies of the BJP. Uh, in a, in like briefly, what can you say about how those TV channels help change the narrative, if not reinforcing the initially existing narrative of the in the minds of the Indians? And how serious is this?
I think it's a very serious topic and a very complex topic also because um, the economic reality of news television is that if you really do news in the conventional sense, like field reporting, sending out outdoor broadcast vans, and so on and so forth, it's a loss-making operation, right?
Right?
So hardly any news television channels are making healthy profits. They are all running under loss. That's the first fact we have to understand. So the reality of news television is that they are actually subsidized by heavy government support, advertising, heavy government advertising. So they are keen to return the favor. That's one thing. The second thing is that there is a very heavy and high degree of both what we call horizontal and vertical integration, which means that there are large industrialists who own different media houses. So the same owner who owns cinema houses also owns telecom, also owns radio, also owns television. So you know the whole kind of that's the horizontal integration. And the vertical integration is that if you own a newspaper, you also own the printing press and you also own the distribution. So within the industry also they have ownership. So, and the second thing about this is that these people who own media also have a lot of other business interests. They are not just media owners. They have interests in manufacturing, they have interests in aviation, they have interests in shipping, textiles, all kinds of things. So I think it makes sense for these industrialists to be on good terms with the government, not just for the media to remain well funded by the government, but also to gain favors in their other business interests. So there is a very cozy nexus between the people who own the mainstream media industries and those who support the current government or even the previous governments. There is a very cozy nexus between big business and mainstream politics in India. And the
So
media
as
is a reflection of that nexus.
okay, so Dr. Ram Bhat, as a media expert, do you think um, what is happening in the media industry, media space of India is counterproductive, or it's okay since the people accept it to be like that?
I think it's obviously counterproductive for any democracy to have even one or two sectors, television, radio, dominated with so much propaganda and partisan content. I think it damages public opinion.
Mm.
It influences what a lot of young people think who might not know the issues. I think it polarizes society. So there are a lot of damaging consequences which the media is playing a role. But I don't think all these things we can blame only the media. I think what is important to realize is the media is merely capitalizing on a deeper decay of society itself. Society is polarized. Society is become communal. Society is casteist. So the media is merely trying to capitalize on these underlying social realities. But I don't think people are also just accepting it. There is a lot of resistance. You will see, for example, a lot of young people in India trying to do things that you are trying to do. Run a news program on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok before it was banned in India. So there
Mm.
is the social media which is being very creatively used by groups who have never had access to the media. So things are also changing because television no longer controls the flow of information. There's also social media which is changing the way people produce, distribute, and receive information.
Yeah. Well, the argument of many Indian journalists and those pro-Modi experts and analysts is that the way the Western media organizations are telling the Indian stories is unfair and, well, to use, um, if I can remember Palki Sharma's word, let's tell our own stories by ourselves. So it's like a reaction to how the international media, the Western media organizations are telling the Indian stories. Don't you think it's also good? And do you think, from your own point of view, that the Western media is not representing fairly the Indian real life reality?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is a way of keeping other people out. We are we have been globalized, shall we say, since 1400 or even earlier. Colonization starts in 1400 roughly, and since then the world is connected in various ways. Um, you know, um, and I think today Indians are there in many parts of the world. Indians are running businesses in Africa, like China, and I think Africans have a right to talk about India as much as African students come to India to study, and there have been, presence of nomadic groups who are continuous tribes in India with African descent. So, there's so many connections between different parts of the world. that it would be very naive to say that only we can tell our story, because who is the we? That way, only Ethiopians have the right to say, because entire humanity came from Ethiopia. So this argument, if we reproduce it, becomes an absurd argument. We are a globalized world, and every government, every society must have the capacity to respond. If they don't agree with a particular representation, then you have a counter representation, and people will make up their mind.
And maybe that's what the Indians are doing, to counter the narrative of the West.
I don't think it's countering. I think it's just ridiculing, trolling, blocking, banning. These are not counter representations. A counter representation is a better story, or a more convincing story, or a better argument, so the viewers can make up their minds. I don't think that
Yeah.
is happening.
People in India may view you as pro-West, given your relationship with LSE, the London School of Economics, among other stuff like that. In Africa here, a lot of people are accusing the Western media organizations of just sending reporters from London or Washington or Germany or something like that to cover African stories, which used to be the dominant thing but right now it has kind of changed because of the pressure. Now we have more Africans reporting for those Western media organizations from Africa. Um, like, do you think maybe there is an element of truth to what the argument of those guys is, that there is no accurate representation of the reality on those international media channels? Like they tend
Of
to,
course, there
yeah,
is a big element of truth in that argument. I do think Western media organizations should hire more local journalists, so the stories are better quality, rather than parachuting Western journalists onto all parts of the world. They cover the stories with very little understanding of the history and context. And this leads to highly Orientalist kind of accounts of, uh, you know, non-Western countries. So that I definitely agree. But I think
yeah,
everything cannot be black and white. One has to see it in the context. So, for example, if there is a climate of censorship, fear, control, where some stories will not come out from the local, then outside media becomes useful to bring these stories to light, right?
yeah.
So I think if a Western media outlet has covered India or the non-West in a particular way, there can be a very detailed argument about what is it that is problematic in these representations, what is false, what is stereotypical, what needs more context, why is it bad quality, what did they miss. That should be the response. The response cannot be that you have no right to comment. I think we are all commenting on each other. It's a global world. That's simply not realistic today.
Okay, so this brings us to the next issue, which is the recently released documentary of what happened, the massacre that took place in Gujarat in 2002, which was linked or has been linked to the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Have you watched the documentary? Because it has sparked a great deal of rage and anger and frustration uh, within India. Have you watched the documentary?
Yeah, actually, there are two documentaries, episode one and episode two. The first episode exclusively deals with 2002 and Modi's role in the 2002 violence. The second part deals with especially Modi's second tenure as prime minister, so 2019 onwards, and a lot of the protests against some of his policies and takes a look at some of the incidents of vigilante violence against Muslims, which took place in his second tenure as Prime Minister. So the second episode is much more recent. And I think both
Mhm.
episodes um, are pointing or raising a question. So the documentary is called the Modi question. So it's really a question about his credentials and capacities as a leader, based on two very different time periods.
Okay. So do you think, is it true that um, Prime Minister Modi had some influence in what happened in 2002?
Yeah, I mean, I have not personally looked at the evidence. I was not personally there in Gujarat, but I have spoken to enough people, and secondhand, I have seen enough literature to convince me that the way Muslims were attacked in
Yeah.
2002 indicates that there was sufficient preliminary planning. How were
Okay.
Muslims identified in mixed neighborhoods? How were
Yeah.
Muslim businesses attacked? So, how did they come to know that XYZ business is owned by a Muslim? So that shows that there was some preparation and planning. Now, preparation and planning at this scale, I would be surprised if the state machinery and the government is completely unaware of it. So, from that angle, it seems that there is some culpability which Modi and his government must accept. And the other thing is that certainly when the violence erupted, the government could have done more to prevent the violence. And I think the government did not act, allowed the violence to unfold over 2, 3 days. So there also, I think Modi and his government must accept some of the responsibility for that massacre.
Yeah. Because
Yeah, that's my
some
belief.
reports
Although
are
I cannot say that I have seen everything firsthand.
yeah, some reports are indicating that the police at that time were watching the violence and they did nothing.
Right. Yeah. There have been so many accounts which attest to that. It's not, I mean, the BBC documentary clearly makes that claim that the police was just watching and not interfering or not preventing the violence. But this is not just the BBC documentary. There have been many Indian activists who have made films, who have written reports, fact-finding, People's Tribunal, so many forums where all
Yeah.
this has been extensively documented and proved. So this is not really about the BBC. This is about, collating what several people have said. And if several people are saying this, then I think there is some degree of credibility to that.
But the people who are pro Modi and the whole government of Modi are saying that the Supreme Court has cleared Modi of complicity in this issue. Why is the BBC bringing this up almost 10 years or 11 years after this?
So there was a special investigative task force which issued a very interestingly worded verdict. They said there is no evidence of a criminal conspiracy. They did not say that Modi is innocent or there is no criminal conspiracy. They are just saying there is no evidence for a criminal conspiracy. That is the that is the
That's it.
exact. Then, secondly, if you look into the Special Investigative Task Force, they have not looked at their own evidence which they have collected. They have not considered. They have failed to consider some key evidence that was collected with their own investigation.
So now the
Third,
BBC is right.
I'm just pointing out the facts. I think people should make up their own mind. There will
Okay.
never be accepted that this is right, this is wrong. In these contested kind of events, there will always be multiple perspectives. But people who are interested, They can go and look at detailed investigation into how the Special Investigative Task Force arrived at their decision that Modi is not guilty. They can go look at that SIT, it is called SIT report. They can look at the SIT report. People have written about whether the SIT report actually does a good job of investigation or even does a logical job of investigation. So there are enough people within India who have raised questions on the SIT investigation. Now, the Supreme Court relies on the SIT investigation. So there is a particular way in which a particular procedure through which Modi has been acquitted. But one can also look at the way in which that investigation was done, compare it to what other people have investigated. Does it mean that the next question can be asked? Does it mean that you have no faith in the court? I'm saying the court is a living institution. It's not some beyond society. Court has some terrible decisions and some very good decisions. And there have been several cases, especially where politicians are complicit in violence. This is not just the BJP. Even the Congress has been involved in violence. And the courts have also failed to hold Congress leaders guilty of violence. Similarly,
Yes.
BJP leaders have, the courts have failed to hold them guilty. So whenever there is violence in politics, politics is closely involved. We see the courts rarely able to hold the political leadership accountable. It seems to be, a feature of the Indian judiciary.
Okay. Briefly, we're running out of time. I've got a few questions to ask you. Um, the BBC is said to have been unfair towards India this time around, BBC in particular, regarding this documentary. I've got two allegations to put here. One is that there is an Indian journalist called Soroji Dasgupta who has accused not only the BBC but the Western media of being anti-BJP government. He also said on a podcast show of First Post, which is one of the biggest Indian media organizations, he said, and I quote, there are more Muslims, more Pakistani journalists in the BBC than the Hindu journalists. And like he said, he based his assertion upon what you called insiders and ex-BBC journalists who said that, and he even goes on by saying in that particular podcast episode that when an editorial decision is going to be taken, the Indians don't have much to say or to counter. Do you believe his words that the BBC is more Muslim-centric against or at the expense of the Hindus?
If the BBC is critical of Brexit, then should we say the BBC is composed more of non-Britishers in that sense? Or if the BBC is critical of Christianity, should we start looking at non-Christian? This kind of analysis is highly absurd. I don't think one can react like this based on every BBC program that comes out. It was released in early January 2023, and I think it comes right after 20 years of Gujarat 2002, right? It marks 20 years. Very likely, the BBC would have commissioned someone to make a documentary. And what is new about the BBC is not actually 2002, but a special report that the then Foreign Secretary Jack Straw had commissioned an investigation, and the documentary actually reveals the contents of that report for the first time. That is the news-worthy element in the documentary. Much of what is shown in the documentary about Gujarat, everyone in India knows about it. I mean, not everyone, but people who are familiar with the matter know about it. There is nothing new in that, for people who are familiar with the matter. But what is new is the probe done on behalf of the Foreign Office in the UK government of 2002. So that is what is new.
Okay. Yeah, and there among the people that lost their lives or that were killed in that Gujarat attack, there were three, I think, British Muslims. So that was why the British government felt compelled to investigate and also file that report,
Absolutely.
right?
But they did the investigation, they never released the report. This documentary
Okay.
is the first time the report has been talked about,
Oh, okay. So the BBC got the report recently and then they aired it in the form of documentary.
I guess. Yeah.
So it's not like the
Okay.
BBC has been planning this in order to undermine the re-election of Prime Minister Modi in the like the next 1 year or
No,
so.
no, I don't think so. I mean, the BBC has not given an official statement about why they made the documentary, why they released it in January 23 and not any other date. They have not given, but to me, it seems like the most newsworthy piece in that documentary is essentially the report which was done in 2003 but never released, and now they are releasing it publicly. Are there other motives? There could be, but it will all be guesswork since there is no way of proving it. So I don't
Yes.
think it's very rewarding to speculate on what the BBC's real intentions are.
Yeah. So we need to wait for their official report
Yeah. I don't
if
know if
they
they will even give an official report.
because they have
Uh,
kept quiet despite the huge criticisms coming out of India against them. Yes.
yeah, I
And
mean
I've got one.
The BBC, to be honest, has been receiving a lot of criticism even from the domestic British population.
Of course.
There is a lot of criticism that the BBC is supporting the UK government, especially on like matters of COVID, vaccination, so many public interest issues.
Mm.
People are criticizing the BBC even on Jeffrey Epstein and many other issues of global relevance. There's been heavy critique of the way BBC has handled many issues. It's not just the India documentary, right? On various documentaries, there is a strong public reaction to the BBC. So the BBC has a formal complaint process. So if a British tax-paying person who subsidizes the BBC has a complaint, then there is a process they can go and complain, and there will be an official investigation into it.
So on a personal note, in a few seconds, um, do you believe in the authenticity of the BBC?
I think the BBC does some things well. I would rather believe the BBC when it covers international issues more than it covers UK issues. I don't trust the BBC on the UK coverage. I trust the BBC on international
Why?
issues.
Why?
Because BBC has less stake on international issues, and the stakes are higher when it comes to covering local issues. So my guess is they would have much less freedom when covering British, or more pressure is put on BBC by the British government when they're covering British programs, and less pressure on BBC when they're covering other international issues.
Let me put this funny stuff to you. Another serious issue that a guy named Mahesh Jetmalani, who is an Indian lawyer and a politician, he is currently a nominated member of parliament in the Rajya Sabha or Sabha. He was, I don't know, sorry, don't mind the pronunciation. He was also a member of the national executive of the Bharatiya Janata Party, that is the BJP, up to 2012. He said in a different interview or in different interview shows, including the one that he had with the controversially aggressive Arnab Goswami, that the BBC is being funded by the Chinese through Huawei. What would you say? Could it be true?
Utter nonsense. The BBC is funded from the UK Parliament. British citizens, or people who are living in the UK have to pay a BBC license fee, and fee that is annually collected. That goes into, to the government, and the government adds its own government money, and it goes from the parliament, not even from the government per se. It goes from a union parliament fund. So that is specifically designed so that the BBC can be an independent public service broadcaster. The only way the government tries to exert some influence on the BBC is by controlling or recommending who gets to be the head of the BBC. So they try to put their person at the head of the BBC, but that does not guarantee. Now, the person can be a supporter of the government while they join, but after they join, if they decide to criticize the government, there's nothing much the government can do about it.
Okay. So this is a false narrative that is being circulated
Completely
in the
false.
media space
Completely
of
false.
India. There's no evidence to assert, to prove that the BBC has been taking money from China.
Absolutely zero evidence.
Okay, but how much of an enemy is China to India?
Uh, I think there is a lot of narrative about China as the enemy, but if you look at trade relations, imports, India is in fact going on deepening its business relations with China. So I think there are some border disputes that keep flaring up from time to time, but there is too much at stake in terms of business for
Okay.
India and China to really go to war with each other. I think it is India that cannot afford to go to war with China
With China.
because
Why?
in terms of the trade implications, there's just simply too much of an economic relationship, economic dependence on China for us to really go to war with China.
So, okay, so there's nothing like that. It's just like when, God forbid, when there is a kind of animosity between India and China, it would be more like China, no, it would be more like Russia and Ukraine going to war. One big
No,
power crushing the other.
I don't think it would even reach that stage. I think while a lot of online outrage, online anger is there against China from the Indian online sphere, at the bureaucratic and governmental level, the Indian government is very well aware that we cannot afford to undertake any war with China. And my estimate is that regardless of whether BJP is in power or Congress is in power, we will not go into a military conflict with China.
All right. We're running out of time. Many thanks indeed, Dr. Ram Bhat, for being on the show. But finally, what is your hope for the Indian media industry in general, newspapers, radio, TV, and so on?
My hope is that more citizens begin to realize that media has real power over their lives, and more Indians start thinking about concrete ways in which they can demand for and work towards a better media system, whether that's community media, private media, because we are related to all of it. We endorse the government to create community media policy. When we subscribe to commercial media, we legitimize them, right? When we pay tax and believe in the government, we legitimize the public broadcasting. So I think my hope is that citizens start taking the media system more seriously, get more involved in the regulation and in the production. I hope that more Indians, especially from groups who have never had access to the media, start taking up digital technology to start, producing their own views of the world, and it
Yeah.
becomes a more democratic and vibrant media space.
All right. What can you say about this show, Global Arena, and the presenter?
I think it's really amazing to see that people like you are working in radio now, doing YouTube shows. I think like India, Nigeria is also a country with many troubles, both social and governmental. There are all kinds of challenges. It's like India, a post-colonial country, religious conflict. So there are a lot of things there, and I really hope that young people like yourself can use platforms, digital platforms, to have more cross-cultural, cross-national discussions so that we can make use of these tools to better understand our societies and learn from each other. So I really appreciate what you're doing and would like to wish you all the best in your future shows as well.
Many, many thanks indeed. And I will go ahead and read your report that you worked on together with our one and only Professor Shakuntala Banaji. She's been very kind. She sent me a 4-minute video when I asked her about her analysis after the appointment of Rishi Sunak, and she's very good, and you're also very good. Many, many thanks indeed, both of you, for your contributions. I'll go ahead and read your book that you wrote, you've written together, Social Media and Hate. That's the title of the book. And that report that you also wrote, which is WhatsApp misinformation, right? It's about WhatsApp and vigilante. I'll also go and read it. I started reading it and I will continue. And I'm sure there are lots of pieces of information, incredible ones, that we are going to learn. Because as I told you, India and Nigeria have a lot in common, as you also said. Well, that's it, I think, on the show. Let me make a quick conclusion to the viewers. All right, on behalf of everyone that has contributed to the show, many, many thanks indeed to Dr. Ram Bhat for being on the show. And we'll see you very soon. And we hope when next we invite Doctor, you'll be able to make it. Doctor.
Yes, of course, happy to always come back and have further discussions. And please keep me posted. I look forward to reading your views and thoughts on some of our work. Thank you.
Good, no problem. Thank you very much indeed. Bye bye.
Thanks. Yeah. Bye.